Good morning, everyone. I'm Taryn Saunders, Thought Leadership Manager at Trialogue, and thank you for joining us this morning. In October, we're hosting a green series in partnership with Nedbank Private Wealth. And today's webinar will explore what businesses and organizations can do to support biodiversity. And the second webinar in the series on Thursday, the 26th of October, will consider the role of companies in growing the green economy. And we'd like to thank Nedbank Private Wealth for supporting the series and initiating these discussions. Just a few quick technical points before we begin. There are two ways to engage. You can use the chat function to connect with fellow delegates and share your thoughts. And we encourage you to ask questions via the Q&A box rather than the chat box. And we'll draw from those for our experts to answer when we get to the discussion section. So please direct your question to the relevant panelist and please keep your questions succinct. A short survey will pop up on your screen at the end of the session and it will also be shared with you via email. And please do share your thoughts here so that we can keep improving these sessions for you. The session is being recorded and the notes and recording will be available to everyone. Moving on to our agenda. After my introduction, I'll be handing over to each of our three experts for their opening comments. We'll then dive into discussion and our experts will answer some of your questions from the Q&A box. And each panelist will then give short closing comments. The first poll will appear on your screen now. We would like to know which type of organization you represent. And we'll leave that on for a few seconds for a brief overview of what Trialogue does. So Trialogue is one of a few consultancies that focus exclusively on responsible business. We do this through our consulting and advisory services, as well as through our thought leadership platforms. With our knowledge sharing platforms, we convene the annual Business in Society conference. We publish the annual Business in Society handbook, which sees its 26th edition this year. Then the Trialogue Knowledge Hub is an online library of research, reporting, case studies, and information on responsible business and development to help inform responsible business decisions. And the write-up and recording of this webinar will be available on the Knowledge Hub. Then the Trialogue Academy is an online learning platform offering courses for both nonprofits and companies. Let's have a look at the results of the first poll. So we've got mainly nonprofit organizations and big business representatives with us today. Thank you so much for that. We'd like to hear from you in our second poll now. If your company or organization has not measured its impact on biodiversity and implemented strategies to actively reverse biodiversity loss, why not? And you can select multiple answers here. We'll leave that up for a few seconds for you to answer. Just a few more seconds to answer that one. If your company or organization has not yet measured its impact on biodiversity and implemented strategies to reverse biodiversity loss, why not? Thank you. Let's look at the results. So most people we are unclear about which metrics and data sources should inform our activities. And the second most popular answer, we have measured our impact and do have a biodiversity strategy. Thank you so much. Right, let's start our biodiversity discussion just with some definitions and some context. So firstly, what is biodiversity? At its simplest, biodiversity is the variability of living organisms from all sources. It includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. And then an ecosystem is a dynamic complex of plant, animal, and microorganism communities and their non-living environment interacting as a functional unit. And this gives us an idea of how biodiversity relates to ecosystems, as well as some of the ways we interact with ecosystems through ecosystem services. This includes the provisioning aspect, such as raw materials, food, and medicinal resources, regulating benefits such as air quality, climate, and water. And then the cultural benefit includes the important and complex ways that humans derive value, including for our mental and our physical health. Another term we'll hear a lot is nature positive, which essentially means reversing the current declines in biodiversity so that species and ecosystems can recover. Biodiversity loss is one of our biggest global crises, along with climate change and pollution, yet it doesn't get as much media attention as you would expect. Most companies do not understand how they are dependent on ecosystems or how they impact biodiversity, which can decrease the sense of urgency. To take a quick look at global biodiversity loss, the numbers are disturbing. So the Living Planet report in 2020 showed large biodiversity declines, including a 65% biodiversity loss in Africa since 1970. And besides biodiversity loss being a global and an existential crisis, there are also clear financial implications. More than half of the world's GDP currently relies on nature at a value of an estimated 44 trillion US dollars. And if ecosystem services collapse, this could create a $2.7 trillion decline in global GDP each year by 2030. And on the flip side, there are opportunities present in a nature positive approach. Nature positive transitions could generate up to $10.1 trillion in annual business value, as well as 395 million jobs by 2030. However, only 35% of South African companies listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange recognize biodiversity as being material. And this is despite the fact that all companies rely on resources or services provided by nature in some way. Biodiversity economy scientist Matthew Child said in last year's Trialogue Business and Society Handbook that a radical mind shift needs to take place among business leaders. They need to realize that biodiversity is not an externality to the economy. It is the economy. There is simply no business without renewable natural resources. And research from last year's Trialogue Business in Society Handbook shows companies spend on environment as a development sector, where biodiversity makes up 3% of overall spend on environment. 31% of companies surveyed supported environment-related initiatives in 2022 as part of their CSI, and environment as a sector received an average of 3% of CSI spend. With biodiversity-related corporate reporting becoming more important, companies need to familiarize themselves with initiatives that allow them to assess and mitigate their impact on biodiversity, as well as to support a nature-positive economy. I'd now like to introduce our panelists. And for now, their cameras and mics are off, and I'll ask them to switch on their cameras and mics one by one. They are Dr. Gabby Terran, Program Manager of the National Biodiversity and Business Network at the Endangered Wildlife Trust, Firoz Kaur, Group Head of Sustainability at Woolworths, and Anne Emmett, grant maker at the Hans Hoheisen Charitable Trust. We'll start with Gabby. Gabby, would you please provide an overview of the status of biodiversity in South Africa and what the role of companies is in addressing this? And you can switch on your camera now.
Thanks, Taryn. And you gave some fantastic global stats earlier on the state of biodiversity and its state that it's in crisis. But I wanted to actually, what does that actually even mean, right? We talk about all these stats all the time. We talk about 65%. South Africa's lost 50% of its original wetland surface area. And we know wetlands provide incredible services to people, such as the basics of clean drinking water, which is very important in a water-stressed country like ours. But South Africa is one of the 17 mega diverse countries in the world, and we're incredibly privileged to have this natural wealth. But what does 17 even mean? So I'm sitting here enjoying a lovely sunny day in Cape Town, and Cape Town, at its last estimate, has over 2,300 plant species alone within the city boundaries. To put that into perspective, the entirety of Britain and Ireland have less than half of that in plant species. So we're incredibly blessed, but it's very threatened. South Africa has the second highest extinction rate of plant species in the world. So it's disappearing rapidly, and the private sector is the #1 driver of biodiversity loss globally. This is mostly from land use change itself. And as biodiversity loss increases, so the coupled crises of climate change and biodiversity interact to compound the effects. So we feel it even more. And companies didn't really recognize this, as you shared from the stat of only 35% of companies even mentioning biodiversity in their policies and procedures that were listed on the JSE. However, this changed, and that's why obviously we're having some of these events and talks. So in December, in Montreal, the Global Biodiversity Framework was signed into being, and essentially this is a framework which the UN Convention on Biological Diversity has put together of a long consultation, and it has specific targets that are related to businesses, and the aim of the framework is to halt and reverse nature loss. And some of these specific targets relate to business, such as requiring all businesses, especially large and transnational and financial institutions, to measure their impacts, dependencies, and risks when it comes to biodiversity, and to disclose these. And the second half of that target is the most important part. Beyond measurement, it's to increase positive impacts and decrease negative impacts. So there are real opportunities for businesses, and businesses are starting to see the risks of biodiversity loss impacting them through, for example, supply chains that are collapsing. It's very scary. So the World Economic Forum identified biodiversity loss and climate change as the biggest risks to global businesses in the long term, more so than geopolitical risks or economic risks. So companies are starting to recognize that they have a role to play, but it's been very slow, and it's been a long journey for companies. But there have been now new frameworks, such as the TNFD, such as the Science Based Targets Network coming out with metrics. There's lots of metrics out there. And I saw one of the comments earlier was that in response to your poll, that we're not sure what metrics to measure. And this has been the case. So we started the Biodiversity Disclosure Project in 2013. And in 2020, we launched the Biodiversity, the Biological Diversity Protocol, which is an accounting framework to address just this. So that companies there's a myth of a single metric. There's no single metric to measure biodiversity. Wetlands should be measured differently to grasslands or to fynbos. You account for bird species differently than what you would account to elephants and your impacts upon them. But biodiversity is pretty simple. It comes down to ecosystems and species, and you use the best available data and science to measure your impacts on ecosystems, specific species, And you can use biodiversity accounting to consolidate all of that and track your progress. So companies need to set targets, make meaningful contributions, and really start on the journey, at least. So I think, does that help? I'm out of time. I could talk about this for a very long time.
Thank you so much, Gabby. And we'll touch on more of that later when we get to the Q&A, but I think that gives us a really helpful perspective, some context to the numbers as well, and an idea of some of the frameworks and metrics that companies use. So thank you so much. And next we'll hear from Feroz. So Woolworths' Good Business Journey strategy to 2025 and beyond is intended to enable the group to be a leading, purpose-driven and truly connected retailer by aiming to address the complex and interconnected sustainability challenges and opportunities. Biodiversity is, of course, one of these key challenges. Please, can you expand on Woolworths' strategy and approach to supporting biodiversity through its operations and its supply chain? And you can turn on your camera and mic now. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning. Thank you, Taryn. Good morning, everybody. So maybe to start off with, to say that as a business, we have a vision at the holding company, or Woolworths Holdings Limited, to be amongst the most responsible retailers in the world. What that does, it gives us a North Star to aim for, to say that our role should be one where we are taking a very wide view as to how we run our operations, and our focus should be on issues which ordinarily we wouldn't think would be within the purview of a business. And so it's about having what I heard somebody describe previously as peripheral vision, understanding everything around us and understanding how we as a business can contribute to that, how this impacts on us, and how we can be a force for positive rather than negative in the world. So we put that into operation through our Good Business Journey, or our what we call GBJ, excuse me, our overall sustainability program. And you alluded to the Vision 2025 strategy that we have. It has three component parts. There's one focusing specifically on people and communities and social justice, etc., which we call IJI, or the Inclusive Justice Initiative. We have one that focuses on our supply chain specifically, which we call ethical and fair, and a third pillar, which is directly environmental, we call thriving and resilient. Within this process and in developing this strategy, we did a number of, we engaged broadly. We looked at what we do as a business. We went through a significant materiality process. And biodiversity was one of those issues which stood out. It's certainly a material issue for us as an organization. It is a key part of our strategy. But it can be a very difficult concept to grasp, particularly within a corporate environment. So we saw in the introductory remarks what biodiversity alludes to. But when you go and talk to leadership, or you talk to colleagues in a business, using terms biodiversity can be alienating to a certain extent. People don't really understand. They don't know what you're talking about, and that's a challenge that we have within businesses. How do we take the language of things like biodiversity, et cetera, ecosystem services, and make it understandable to organizations? In terms of where biodiversity is important to us, there's two key areas, right? As an organization, there's our own operations. So where do we exist? Where do we operate directly? But more importantly for us is within our supply chain. Where do we source product from? Given the nature of what we do we're not just a retailer, but we're a brand, right? Most of our product carries Woolworths or associated brand on it. And products are made or sourced for us locally and globally. And this is where understanding what biodiversity means and making it relevant to an organization is important, because I think it's the appreciation of the fact that practically everything we make or sell comes from some natural process. Now, I heard the stat earlier around 50% of everything or global economy is dependent on nature. And that's valid depending on what you're doing. Now, in our case, we produce and sell products either for food or within the clothing beauty world. And practically everything comes from either a farm or forest or some kind of natural process, whether it's food from plants or food from animals, or fibers or textures from plants, whether it's cotton or from trees, whether it's viscose or some other cellulosic fiber. whether we're getting fabric from animals, wool from sheep, leather from cows, etc., etc. And it's about understanding that these processes have an impact on the world, right? And there's risks and opportunities for us to do things better. There's a risk on us supporting processes which are not ideal for the environment. There's a risk from, so are we contributing to negative impacts in the world? Are we sourcing ethically? And there's also the risk on, well, what's the reverse risk of that, us not doing something properly, and what does it impact in the business? So it's about understanding, I think in the sustainability world, they call it double materiality. But essentially, it's about breaking down this concept and understanding that actually we are not separate from the world. We all exist in the same environment, and we need to be running our business in a manner that's aware and respectful of the bigger picture. So when we talk about ecosystem services, for example, it's about appreciating that if we can have natural pollination, for example, and we've heard about colony collapse around bees globally, we know that there's not going to be sufficient pollination of food and even other crops that we rely on. So I think stats say that if all the bees and pollinators disappeared, we'd have roughly a year or two of food production, and then we're going to be in trouble as a species. So it's about us as a business understanding, okay, so what does it mean for us? How do we ensure that we're not contributing to this problem? How do we ensure that when we source commodities, whether it's cocoa or palm oil or coffee or cotton or whatever that other commodity is, that we do it in a responsible manner? And so it's about setting targets and goals and commitments and understanding it for ourselves to say that, yes, we source cocoa. This is how we're going to do it. This is what we're going to do. What is the best standards in the world? Who do we work with? It requires us to understand the supply chains fully, understand the best standards in the world, who is leading international NGOs, etc., sourcing organizations, driving for change. We also have what we call the Farming for the Future program. We have Fishing for the Future. Farming for the Future is 12 years old now. It's a program that we designed and run with the help of independent agronomists and academics around ensuring that when we source from farms, the product we source is sourced with respect for nature. Essentially, it's about soil health. Everything stems from soil health, whether it's water, biodiversity, use of inputs, insecticides, etc., etc. And it's about balancing this complex issue. It's about understanding the climate impact on what we do, impact on water, agriculture, and we work with suppliers who meet our values, and who are aligned to our values and who can meet our standards. So we've got various goals that we've put in place, which have been signed off by the board, and which are then broken down into key KPIs for the organization, whether it's about traceability in our supply chain, whether it's about transparency, about responsible sourcing of commodities, aiming for net zero carbon impact. We've got commitments around water in our supply chain, working with the Global Water Resilience Coalition and the CEO Water Mandate. We've got goals around food loss and waste aligned to the UNDG SDGs. I mentioned our Farming for the Future, which falls within what we increasingly hear spoken about being regenerative agriculture, where we give back more than we take. Also interesting is that there's a lot of evolution in the space. So for a long time, there hasn't been necessarily any strict guidelines as to what a business needs to follow within this concept of biodiversity. But things like the TNFD that Dr. Terence spoke about is starting to change that, starting to set in place guidelines and overview of how businesses need to approach this. And I think it's a welcome development. It's still early days. TNFD was just launched a couple of months ago, but I think it's a step in the right direction. I think what I would leave with is for companies to understand that you need to understand materially what does biodiversity mean for you. It is a difficult concept. It's not an easy conversation to have in a boardroom. You get lots of blank stares if you just go in there and start talking about biodiversity. But it's about breaking it down and understanding where in your business, whether it's in your supply chain, whether in your direct operations or anywhere else, that biodiversity plays a role, where you have an impact, and basically understanding and unpacking it. And essentially, I think that I'll leave it there for now as my introductory remarks.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for touching on that from so many different angles and perspectives as well. And especially for breaking it down clearly for us from a business perspective. And we'll touch on some more questions around that later. So thank you. And next we'll hear from Anne Emmett. So the Hans Hoheisen Charitable Trust was established to fund the conservation of South Africa's flora and fauna, and it's managed by Nedbank Private Wealth. So the trust provides grants to conservation bodies engaged in physical biodiversity conservation and working in the cross-cutting environmental governance and advocacy, climate change, research and education arenas. And as a funder in this area with years of experience, where do you think that funders can have the biggest impact on biodiversity? You can switch on your camera and unmute. Thanks.
Thank you for that question, for your question, Taryn, and good morning to all. So the question of achieving biggest impact is an interesting question, because there are seldom quick wins in funding biodiversity conservation. It's more a case of achieving impact over a lengthy process and time period. And ideally, there's seldom quick wins. Ideally, this is to be based on an integrated strategy in alignment with biodiversity loss needs, and using data science like that Gabby and yourself, Taryn, referred to earlier, and in alignment with your own core purpose as an entity, as a company, as a foundation. Plus, an important point that Firoz mentioned, the utilization of peripheral vision, matters that don't necessarily feature in your mission, but directly impact on it. And I think that's an important new addition to thinking about how do we fund and what are our strategies in funding biodiversity conservation. So in deciding on a strategy, quite a number of entities have very specific focus, because there's a belief that greater impact can be achieved by focusing on, for instance, wild dogs, pangolins, African penguins. But increasingly, it's becoming more known that these species do not exist in isolation of the greater ecosystem that they function in. We heard a lot about ecosystems earlier. And in funding activities and work in this area, ideally, one would look at aspects such as research to determine what exactly is happening in the particular focus area, to determine, for instance, the baseline, to begin to set your baseline measurements and metrics for measuring. And also research to develop conservation management plans, so that it doesn't remain research for the sake of research, but actually research that has use value, that can be used for ecosystem and species conservation. Also, you could be funding physical biodiversity work. That's the actual work to rescue, to rehabilitate, to treat species. We could also be funding education, either at school level or at tertiary level. And an important aspect in engaging in your work as a funder, I do believe, is to be actively involved with your stakeholders, communities. Communities are very, very important stakeholders and are quite often overlooked in developing biodiversity conservation strategies. And also there are other partners like government who play critical roles in the multi-stakeholder approach framework to developing sustainable and long-term impact in biodiversity funding. Also, it's been my experience that one can develop an approach that you work and fund both the larger entities working in biodiversity conservation, because they are more well-resourced. They've got a track record of implementation. They've got more resources, as I said. But also there are the smaller non-profits and community-based organizations that can be overlooked. And I advocate, and in our work, we advocate working with both larger and smaller entities. And there are advantages in both. The smaller ones tend to be at the coalface. They know the community, they know what's happening. Another interesting approach to achieving a large-scale impact is that we have to fund, I do believe, and it's our experience in the Hoheisen Charitable Trust, to fund over the long term. Achieving large-scale impact, it's not an overnight event. It's long-term with multi-year grant commitments. Also, we do fund core and running costs because we do believe that one cannot implement programs without people, without offices, without equipment, without data, etc. So we have to be realistic. We need people, and we need people that are happy to implement our programs. So we cannot overlook core and running costs. And also in our practice in the trust, more and more we're finding that it's important to fund governance, good governance in our partners. Governance, if we have good boards, good governing bodies, good associates, our experience is that we have good implementation and good accountability. Lastly, I want to say, as a funder, it's important to know what are your objectives as a funder. What are the outcomes that you want to support, and know what indicators you will use to actually measure those outcomes, and then do regular reviews so that you continuously learn and improve in your practice. I'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you, Taryn.
Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you for bringing all those different aspects to light as well, and especially for reminding us that there are no quick wins, that it's an integrated process. All sorts of integrated strategies are involved with many different stakeholders. You also brought up that long-term funding is appropriate for these goals, and of course the importance of bringing in communities as part of these strategies. So thank you for bringing that to light. I'd like to invite all of our panelists to turn on your cameras now, and we'd like to go into a bit of a Q&A session from the audience. So the first one is for Gabby. So you touched on the biological diversity protocol. There's a question here from Louise asking about how one finds out more about the protocol. That was from an NGO perspective. We'd love to hear more about that from, firstly, how it can help companies mitigate their impact on biodiversity, and then how it can help NGOs as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Taryn, and yeah, thanks for the question. And so the protocol was developed really in response to, I think what Feroz was touching upon was the blank stares that you get at a kind of a CEO or boardroom level around measuring biodiversity. It's too complex. By its very nature, pun intended, it's too complex. How do we measure it? How do we even start? And companies have just gotten on board with the greenhouse gas protocol and measuring their metric tons of equivalent of CO2, which is essentially accounting. So we developed the BD protocol as an accounting framework, and it does several key things. It measures your state of biodiversity. So biodiversity, as Feroz mentioned, and as Anne touched on, is the product of lots of different drivers and functions over long time periods. But at any one point in time, at any one point in space, you can measure the state of biodiversity. So the state of your grassland. Is it in a good state, in a bad state relative to the actual ecosystem that it should have been. So it measures the end state, but what it does is uses lots of metrics from different ecosystems, so very specific metrics from ecosystems, consolidates them all together into headline KPIs of your positive biodiversity footprint, your negative biodiversity footprint over time, so consolidated, and also periodic. So you can measure your progress and you track your changes to what you've done to improve or to degrade the state. So it completely obliterates greenwashing because it keeps a complete audit trail. And those headline KPIs were what the CEOs were wanting. They were wanting a snapshot in time. Don't tell me about the little shrew down the road that we're impacting. I don't know anything about shrews. I didn't know that they were important. I didn't know they existed. What is our positive footprint? What is our negative footprint right now? Let's set a target and let's track progress and meet it and disclose it. And so it does that. So the protocol is freely available. It's a scientific document, fairly technical in nature, but it lists all of the steps that you have to take in processes, freely available on our website. And it's been rolled out globally, recognized, by example, by the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, as the key accounting framework. So we're very proud of that. So it's there to assist anyone, any large company, any small company, any NGO. If you've got a patch of land, if you've got an ecosystem and you've got species, you want to measure the state of it and account for it and track its changes over time and use the best available data and science. So I hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Gabby. That's incredibly helpful. And another that we touched on is the biodiversity disclosure project. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about that, and also whether you've achieved some success with working with companies on their mitigation strategies?
So the biodiversity disclosure project was set up so that we track disclosure. We track disclosure practices. We would create awareness. Essentially, it was an awareness creating tool, working with companies, with the institutions such as stock exchanges, and also with frameworks. So we advised, for example, the TNFD, which has become a kind of a guiding light at the very start of its journey right now. So there's a lot of work still to be done. And essentially, it's bringing the best available science to the conversations, creating awareness of the issues that companies have to face, and creating real tools and solutions to manage biodiversity to show positive impacts and improvements. So we've been able through our project to, number one, get biodiversity accounting seen as a helpful tool and develop that and get feedback from companies on that. A rating of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange on biodiversity policies, and that was then rolled out to the IBEX 35 Spanish Stock Exchange, so that gained some traction. But where we're going to next, which I think is more exciting, is around the mitigation strategies, so the measurement and management and helping companies have management plans in place for managing their biodiversity, but right back to the drawing board as well with capacity building and developing courses and material to help any company in any sector understand what biodiversity means and matters to them. So that's the next phase in the horizon.
Thank you so much, Gabby. And this one may be bringing us a little bit back to the beginning, but in terms of getting started and how that may be overwhelming for companies with all the different metrics and all the measures and all the tools that are available, how would you suggest that those who are overwhelmed with where to start, how do you suggest that they get involved?
Great question, because I think I've mentioned the TNFD twice. Rose mentioned it, and we haven't even explained what the acronym even meant. And companies and sustainability managers and NGOs and everyone involved in the space are drowning in this alphabet soup of acronyms all the time. It can be completely overwhelming. So a first place I would suggest to start is really to understand your relationship with biodiversity and nature, your dependencies. And Feroz illustrated that incredibly well, is understanding their main impacts are in supply chain and unpacking where that is and how better to develop protocols and strategies around that. So real practical examples. There's also mainstreaming guidelines that we have developed, which we're actually about to update, which are going to be on our website, which kind of give us stepwise how to think about biodiversity, how to set targets, what does it mean for companies. But there is a whole plethora of information out there. The SBTN and TNFD are providing guidance documents as we speak. The one thing I would suggest to also just look out for is there's a big assessment that's happening at the moment by IPBES, and I'm going to explain that acronym so everyone doesn't drown in it. It's the Intergovernmental Panel of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So it's a UN body essentially, which provides scientific assessments of biodiversity, and they're very large assessments with lots of co-authors from scientists all over the world giving a state of what this is. And the business and biodiversity assessment is currently underway. I'm one of the lead authors of one of the chapters, so I'm heavily involved in it. And it's been fast-tracked to come out, I think, probably early 2025. So that's a key document that's going to give an overview of everything up to date. And they can also get in touch with us or any other NGOs working in the space. We've got key questions, and it's about showing commitment and getting the journey started. I think that's the most important part.
Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing all of those different documents and where we can go for information next. You touched on practical examples, and I know, Feroz, you've shared quite a lot with us about the journey that you've gone through with Woolworths and your strategy. And there are a couple of questions coming in for you about different aspects of that. I'd love it if you could go into a little bit more detail and share some more detail with us on the risks that biodiversity loss poses for you, for your business, and some of what you're working on at the moment. Some of the questions that have come through, programs that support Indigenous farmers, so as part of your supply chain, as well as packaging that's not recyclable or biodegradable. So there are a lot of aspects that you're thinking about and bringing into your strategy, and we'd love it if you could share a bit more of those with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So, yeah, I think the starting point, and I think we said it already, and many of the other speakers spoke about it. It's a very complex space, right? So there's so many touch points. There's so many issues that fall within the concept of biodiversity. We've got various programs in place. I mentioned, and I'll talk to what we're doing in the supply chain specifically. Our ethical sourcing focus is really, really important for us. We've had commitments and goals over many, many years. We've got a commitment which I think we set in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, is about sourcing all our key commodities from responsible sources. We've added an additional element in our current strategy, is to build in the concept of traceability to that. We think that over time it's important, and people want to know where products are coming from, and part of traceability talks to understanding your supply chain. If we are able to articulate to an end consumer where a product comes from, it means we understand all the steps that go through it. And oftentimes there's a lack of appreciation of just how complex global supply chains are, how many players there are, and how sometimes it's very difficult to know where something actually comes from. So we're putting a big focus on the concept of traceability and transparency as well. And the flip sides of the same coin. So what I mean by that is, about transparency is not just about saying at a product level, but it's to say this product you're holding in your hand comes from this part of the world, or it's ethically sourced. But it's also about able to start listing suppliers and saying, this is actually who I actually bought this product from. We started it in our fashion business, and we're going to evolve that through in different ways through our organization. So I think it's getting a sense of where and how something is sourced, and in so doing, you understand what the dynamics are around that. So where is the farm located? What kind of inputs is it using? What kind of outputs are there? What kind of negative impact are they on the environment? Are we sourcing in water scarce areas? Are we engaging in water basins which need further support? So we've got a lot of work we do, for example, with the WWF around basin level work on water. So in as much as we've got a lot of work on water with the farmers we source from, we know that the issue of water doesn't start at end at the farm gate. A farmer is, and we're all part of a broader ecosystem. So the water that gets to the farmer comes from somewhere, and the water that leaves the farm goes somewhere else. And it's going into nature, it's going into communities, it's coming from communities. And how then do we appreciate that bigger picture? So we've had basin level work going on for at least the last 8 to 10 years around being part of broader engagements beyond just our supply chain, enabling work with local communities, municipalities, et cetera, so that there's a appreciation holistically around the use of water, for example. So I spoke about sourcing commodities, I spoke about water. Question about packaging has come up, and that's a really, really interesting one, because there are no simple solutions in any of these things that we're trying to address. They're very complex, and there's oftentimes there are trade-offs that need to be had. Certainly, packaging and plastic in the last few years has been something that people have been focusing a lot on, and we've been on a journey of looking at our packaging for a long time. In 2018, we made some commitments around how we have a vision of zero packaging waste to landfill, meaning none of our packaging should ultimately have to go to landfill, which places an imperative on us to ensure that we design appropriately, we use the correct materials, we ensure we don't overpackage, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, though, there needs to be an appreciation, especially in food, that packaging plays a big technical role. It protects product, it allows it to be transported. For food products, there's labeling protocols, you list ingredients, et cetera, which need to go on packaging. So we need to ensure that we use the right type of packaging, that we use the right materials, that we label it appropriately. As I said, we don't overuse packaging. Where we can take packaging off materials, we do a lot of trials. If you've been in one of our trial stores now, you look at we're trialing bananas that are not in plastic bags. They're wrapped with a paper band. We do a lot of trials, etc., around removing unnecessary packaging. But we also know that packaging plays a strong role in many cases in preventing food loss. Now, if we're talking about biodiversity, we need to understand what goes into producing something. And if you throw fresh produce away, my view is not just throwing the product itself, but you're throwing all the inputs that went into it as well. You're throwing the nutrients that went into it, the soil, the water, et cetera, et cetera. And so we've done, for example, life cycle assessment of cucumbers. We've often had people asking us, well, why do you wrap your cucumber in plastic? We knew intrinsically that it lengthens the life, but we then we funded life cycle assessments of it, and the results show that the cucumber lasts twice as long with that wrapping on it. Now the question is, how do we make a choice here? Is it packaging versus food waste, or can we address both? So what we did is we continue to wrap the cucumber, but we've wrapped it in packed plastic, which is now recycled and collected in South Africa for recycling. So these issues are not binary. There are no simple solutions to things. It requires us to be honest around the complexity of issues we're dealing with, and to try and balance the various competing interests. We don't necessarily at the moment have much biodegradable packaging, and that's by design. It's because a lot of biodegradable packaging requires specific conditions for them to biodegrade. And they're no different to any other single-use type of packaging. If the conditions don't exist, in many cases, they're not collected by recyclers because they contaminate recycling schemes. So we're working with industry bodies. We're part of collective actions such as, for example, the South African Plastics Pact, which is a voluntary initiative linked to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation globally, around driving the elimination of unnecessary single-use packaging, increasing the use of recycled content, increasing recyclability. There's also a lot of industry developments which are helpful in this space. For example, the EPR, or Extended Producer Responsibility Regulations, which came into play about 18 months ago, where all organizations which are involved in the production or use of packaging, like ourselves, have to pay a levy to an organization known as a PRO, a Product Responsibility Organization. And that funding goes to specifically improving recycling rates, collection of packaging, funding of infrastructure for actual recycling, etc., etc. We've got commitments around using more recycled content in our packaging, which go back to 2018, ensuring. So where we stand now, we at least just over 90% of our packaging is technically recyclable. What that means is that and remember, we're not recyclers. So we work with the recycling industry, we pay our levies, we encourage recycling collection. But if the equipment exists in South Africa, at least 90% of our packaging will be recycled. There's a few technical types of packaging use which are not recyclable globally, but there are developments and innovation happening. And as those filter into the market, we roll them out. For example, we're one of the first retailers in the world whose coffee bags are now fully recyclable. Historically, they were lined with foil to keep coffee beans and coffee grounds fresh. Ours have eliminated that. We're the only retailer in South Africa, and as I said, one of the few in the world using that. So as technology comes in, we incorporate it. Again, it's complex, but certainly it won't happen without dedicated focus, without commitments, and without targets.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Feroz. And thank you again for bringing some of those complexities to light to us again, and also for explaining so clearly some of the trade-offs that you do have to make when considering all of these different aspects along each step of the way and along so many different aspects of what you do. So thank you. And before we jump into quick closing comments from each of the panelists, I'd just like to hear a little bit more from Anne, just around a bit more of the role of nonprofit organizations and the trust. So if you could chat a bit about the role of nonprofit organizations in enhancing biodiversity, as well as how you think that nonprofits can best work with funders like the trust and with companies as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. So the role of nonprofits in achieving improved biodiversity status and conservation is quite an important one. I think firstly, for a number of trusts like ourselves, we can only fund nonprofit organizations that are public benefit organizations. So that is our target group as such. I think it's important to also realize that as a trust, as a funder, we actually can't do our work. We can't achieve our outcomes and our mission without the existence and our partnership with nonprofits. So it's a synergistic relationship, and it should be premised ideally on partnership. We have mutually reinforcing missions, and I think historically as well, in the biodiversity sector and more broadly, nonprofit organizations have been meeting the gaps left in services by either government or business or other entities. Nonprofits are actually getting in there and doing the work and ensuring that important issues are being brought to the fore of what is actually happening in various sectors, including obviously biodiversity. So your question about the aspect of your question about how best nonprofits could work with funders. As I said, it's a synergistic relationship. I think I mentioned the aspect of governance earlier, and that brings me to speak about accountability. Obviously, there's mutual accountability as well. But I do believe that nonprofits can do a lot more to improve accountability by communicating with funders when things go well and when things don't go so well. Things happen. There are mudslides, there are floods, implementation is hampered. Communication and accountability and explanation, engaging in a dialogue with the funder is part of that partnership, that mutually beneficial partnership. On the other hand, funders are quite flexible as well in understanding when objectives can't be implemented in a particular time frame. Yeah, shall I leave it there?
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for emphasizing again the importance of partnerships within those relationships as well. With just 5 minutes left until the end of this session, I just want to ask each of the panelists for your brief closing thoughts, and if you could keep these to 1 minute each if you can. And that's, what practical recommendations do you have for companies that want to prioritize nature positive initiatives? And we'll start with Gabby.
Practical recommendations. I think from the perspective is that there should be pressure placed on the decision makers in companies from the staff themselves. The staff, I think, are being made aware of these issues, the crises that we all face, cost of living crises, climate crises, biodiversity crises, and to be placing more pressure on the companies that they work for to do better and do good. That's a very basic one, but we should all be working together to create awareness.
Thank you so much, Gabby. And Feroz, if I can ask you the same question, what practical recommendations do you have for companies that want to prioritize nature positive initiatives?
Probably at the risk of repeating myself, I would say understand what it means in your type of business. So, you know, whatever we as a retailer, as a product or a producer, private label producer, we need to understand what it means for us. So whatever your business type is, you need to unpack where the impact is, where you impact on nature and where nature impacts on you, and focus on that. You need to focus on, I think it's about materiality. It's no use focusing on things that are immaterial to you, because your ability to make impact there is fairly limited. Understand what is material for you and your business. Start there. I think from there you can build a plan out.
Thank you so much. Some helpful tips there. Thank you. And Anne, same question for you. What are your practical recommendations for companies and organizations that want to prioritize nature positive initiatives?
Thank you. Yes, I agree with Gabby. We need to talk more with one another. We need to be forming partnerships and be collaborating more. And in that way, create greater awareness about nature positivity and the greater overall impact when we actually work together to meet these biodiversity challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you so much for, I mean, you've brought up how important it is for us all to keep discussing this and to keep bringing these issues to light. So thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists for your time and your insights today. And thank you for Nedbank Private Wealth for bringing this vital topic to light and for opening this discussion. In the last 2 minutes, I'd just like to share how you can keep in touch with us and how we can keep this conversation going. So firstly, you can read more about biodiversity, environment, and many other responsible business and development topics on the Trialogue Knowledge Hub, and this session will also be shared there. You can increase your nonprofit's visibility through inclusion on the NPO directory, which is also on the Trialogue Knowledge Hub. Save the date for our Trialogue Business in Society conference next year on the 14th and 15th of May. Connect with us on social media, your social media of choice, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. And then, of course, please do join us on the 26th of October for the next webinar in the series on growing the green economy. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.